Welcome everybody. This is our video for class for the 4th of August for Tuesday, where I've collapsed two chapters together, newspapers and journalism, since they seem like they would be a good fit. Obviously, journalism is more than just newspapers, and it bridges into radio, and it bridges into television, and it bridges into the internet, and in fact, even bridging into film, which we will talk about when we get to our film section. But I thought it might make sense for us to talk about it in the context of newspapers. But before I begin, you can see that I've put a link to a recent article from several days ago about some hearings that were being held with our tech giants. You'll remember we had an chapter about the internet, and we were talking a little bit about some of the major players in the internet, things like Amazon, for instance, and Facebook. And I thought it would be of interest to you, especially when we were talking about the idea of monopolies and oligopolies. So you can read that and get a sense as to what is current in relation to those ideas, as we proceed forward with talking a little bit about newspapers and journalism. Thanks to some of you who have contacted me already about some ideas that you have for the final project. That's terrific. The sooner you can decide on a topic, the better off you are, because then you can devote some time to it. So I encourage all of you to do that sooner rather than later. And perhaps you might be interested in doing something in relation to newspapers and journalism. And you can see that in our notes, I've talked a little bit about investigative reporting, which started in the 1880s with Nellie Bly, actually. And she reported in the 1800s mental institution abuses. And in fact, if we fast forward 100 years or so, we can see how the Washington Post did the same thing in the 1970s with the Watergate scandal. So at that point, you can think of newspapers as being a democratic vehicle for exposing hypocrisy and for exposing corruption. Which gets us into the third section about newspapers and what are the purposes of newspapers. And that could be a class in and of itself, whether it's to expose corruption, which is part of the early origins of newspapers, whether it's documenting historical events. So I myself remember going to the Barack Obama presidential election and buying as many newspapers as I could from Washington, saving it as a kind of memento and a documentation of a historical event. As a vehicle for democracy, particularly when we talk about the 1800s and newspapers and so many immigrants coming to the United States who oftentimes learned how to read and write through their newspaper readership. And newspapers were oftentimes directed not just towards literacy, but the idea too of helping to, well, for lack of a better word, indoctrinate, perhaps socialize is a little less harsh, immigrants into American culture and to American society. As you know, we began the semester talking about advertising, and certainly we could say that the purpose of a newspaper is an advertising platform, just like we'll talk about the possible purposes for magazines next class. Political and social indoctrination goes all the way back to the 1800s, as I was previously mentioning, but it goes to our current time about the idea of a newspaper influencing public opinion. And then, of course, one of the major issues with newspapers is sensationalism. If you've ever heard the term yellow journalism, and that actually comes from a comic strip known as The Yellow Kid, where there were two newspaper Mongols who were both arguing over the ownership of that particular news strip, and that was Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst. And William Randolph Hearst is going to be incredibly important when we start talking about the idea of media Mongols. And William Randolph Hearst is something that we will revisit when we get to the film section. We get to talk about the film Citizen Kane. But basically in the late 1800s, he acquired, from the late 1800s and the early 1900s, he had acquired an incredible mass of media outlets. So he was very much in control of the information that people were receiving, which is very similar to the late 1900s, again approximately 100 years later, where we've got a Rupert Murdoch, who perhaps is best known for establishing Fox News. in the middle of the 1900s. And he too has an incredible power in terms of disseminating information, which means he has incredible power in terms of influencing public opinion. Now, thinking about the idea of what is newsworthy, which is also in our notes, some of the suggestions could be that which is timely. The idea that a newspaper, at least pre-internet, was a rather rapid way to get information on a daily basis. Proximity, and we oftentimes talk about local newspapers and they talk about local events, or just American newspapers focusing on the idea of what's happening in the United States first and foremost. Conflict, for better or for worse, is newsworthy, and it's something that we've seen take off with media in terms of some of the reality television shows that had their early origins perhaps in some of these talk shows that were pseudo news and pseudo entertainment, and that focused on the idea of conflict. Prominence, that which is important. Though that said, we could debate, that oftentimes is subjective, the idea of importance. Human interest, and we oftentimes see those sections in newspapers, and it's something that local newspapers pride themselves on, and that we can learn a little bit more about our neighbors and a little bit more about humanity. That which is of consequence, that which is going to have basically a major impact on our lives, which is related to importance, but it is somewhat different. And again, that also, it can be something that's considered to be subjective. That which is useful, and that too is subjective based on the individual, but if you oftentimes think about the content that's shared in terms of information in newspapers and how to do things in newspapers, you've got information about recipes, and you've got information about home ownership and decorating, even obituaries. Novelty, and that's one of the things that oftentimes captures interest. It's one of the things I talk about in my English classes in terms of capturing an audience's interest, is that we like to hear about that which is different, even deviant. And I suspect that all of these elements have newsworthiness embedded within them. We think about the history of newspapers and just journalism, that started with news sheets in BC Rome, but then we can move to town criers and colonial newspapers, which is basically our area in New England. The 1800s and the Industrial Revolution led to the idea of mass media, that newspapers could be available to the masses at a relatively inexpensive cost. And the Associated Press was the first major wire service in 1846, where it was a merging of 6 New York newspapers. And initially it was through telegraph, and eventually radio waves, and then finally digital transmissions. And I know that one of the major issues about news is trustworthiness, and who can we trust and what can we trust in terms of getting our news. And that's been particularly important in the last several years. If I had to choose a news source outside of the idea of using as many sources as possible so that you can fact check against them and make sure that those sources are owned by different entities so that you're getting different voices, I would say that my personal go-to place is the Associated Press, to try to get a sense of objectivity, assuming that objectivity can even exist in journalism. There always is a certain level of bias. Now, journalism is the only media practice in business that's specifically mentioned and protected by the U.S. Constitution, which is why there's probably such a push for objectivity. And if you've heard of the 5 W's of journalism, the who, what, when, where, why, and there can be a sometimes how, which doesn't conveniently start with the W, but the fact of trying to answer the major questions as quickly as possible. And the New York Times was viewed as the newspaper of record, trying to get away from some of the sensationalism of the William Randolph Hearst newspapers and trying to focus more on information. But as you know, in the last several years, the New York Times, as well as every news outlet, has been under review about how objective they really can be. And I don't know if you've ever heard of Jason Blair, and this was in the early 90s, and this was before many of our conversations about fake news. But in the early 90s, Jason Blair was a reporter for the New York Times, and his assignment was to interview a soldier from the Iraqi war. And specifically to interview her family because she was still at war, and her family lived in the Midwest. And it was one of these, human interest stories, and he published the story. But the family contacted the newspaper to indicate that they were very confused because they never interviewed with this reporter, and there were numerous factual errors, some very basic ones, like the color of their home. And as the New York Times did some research, they found out that the reporter, Jason Blair, never went to the Midwest. He stayed in New York City, which is where the New York Times is housed. And they had documentation of that because he had charged a business lunch at a local restaurant in New York City. So basically, he fabricated the entire story. And as the New York Times continued to delve deeper, they found out that he'd been fabricating stories for quite a long time. So even something as respected as the New York Times in the 1990s could be subject to factual errors, which is why I'm always hesitant to tell anybody to trust any particular news source. You want to try to consume as many as possible, and then you want to try to make a valid judgment based on that. The difficulty, of course, is that so many news sources are owned by one particular individual or corporation. While it might seem like you're getting an overview, what you're really getting is one particular perspective. Now, the text talks a little bit about different kinds of journalism, whether you could have interpretive journalism, where the journalist feels this need to have some sort of a historical or social context in relation to their reporting. Or if you've got literary journalism, which is more in the vein of storytelling, more like fiction. USA Today was a very interesting experiment in journalism because it embraced the idea of visual culture. At that point in the 1980s, television was at its heyday. And as of 2019, USA Today had the #1 circulation in the United States. They keep flipping back and forth with the Wall Street Journal, which is owned by Rupert Murdoch. What the Wall Street Journal did in terms of business practices was incredibly smart. They established a paywall early on rather than giving away their content for free, which is what many news organizations were doing and is one of the major reasons why news organizations are suffering because of the internet. That said, if you want to think about something like online news and social media, which is how many people are getting their news, in some ways that's a revolution because we've got all of these different voices and perspectives that aren't censored. But yet in other ways it's very problematic, particularly when we start talking about whether or not we are getting truthful information and whether or not we are being influenced to one particular position or another. We know that national news is going to be conflict-oriented and that local news is probably going to concentrate more on consensus. And a lot of that has to do with advertising. If you're a local newspaper, then you don't want to offend your local advertisers. And you've got specialized newspapers that'll target particular demographic groups. And the rise in satirical news, where you've got news that's fake that perhaps is less fake, however, than the news that purports to be real. So there's a certain level of irony there. When you think about all of the issues surrounding newspapers and surrounding journalism, there are quite a few, and I've just highlighted some of the major ones. American ethnocentrism, which could be said for this entire class when we talk about media. In fact, it's been oftentimes discussed that America's biggest import is its media, so that our ethnocentrism is influencing the globe as a whole. Misinformation and fake news, and what can we trust in terms of news. Partisanship, which has become increasingly popular in news reporting. The days of where you would have a newsman like Walter Cronkite who tried to maintain a level of objectivity, though Walter Cronkite was also famous for going to the Vietnam War and observing what was happening in the Vietnam War himself and giving his personal opinion that he thought that the United States should withdraw from Vietnam. And that's one of the major reasons why, basically, the United States did so. So his the respect that he had as a newsman is probably a respect that no news force has today. And the idea of what are the ethics in reporting the news and giving information, and how ethical should a reporter be. And all of this is embedded into what I think of as the beginnings of how our news cycle changed to where we are today. When we started through cable news with the 24/7 news cycle, and of course that was taken up and brought further with internet news. And if I had to highlight one particular person, it would be Rupert Murdoch and his creation of Fox News in the mid-1990s that basically changed cable news so that everyone, in order to remain competitive, began to follow that particular formula of increasing partisanship and increasing conflict rather than trying to aim for objectivity. And there's a documentary that I would like you all to watch, and even though it's a bit dated, it'll give you an idea of how all of this began, or perhaps what the major impetus was for all of this beginning. And that documentary is entitled Outfoxed. It was done in 2004, and it was still a time where there were still questions about the validity of the news that individuals were getting on cable. And there was still some debate as to whether or not cable news was more informative rather than persuasive. And I think for the most part, we've reached the point in our society where we agree that cable news and other news sources are more persuasive rather than informative. And Fox did it very well, and then all of the slew of imitators came. So the documentary will give you a little bit idea of the historical perspective of this. And I've oftentimes said that a media and popular culture class is as much a history class as anything else, because we learn about our past and we learn how ultimately that past has influenced our present. So this particular documentary, I had some difficulty finding a version of it because of copyright issues. The version that I was able to find was on YouTube, and I hope that it is still accessible by the time you view it. So I know that oftentimes individuals will post things on YouTube and then they will remove them because of copyright issues. If you're having difficulty accessing the video, please let me know. Again, the video is called Outfoxed. It was done in 2004, and that video will form the basis of today's attendance question, which is, how do you think journalism has changed since that 2004 documentary about Outfoxed? So that you will answer in our class form. And as you know, we continue along with our journals, going back and forth. I hope you're thinking a little bit about your final project. We are approximately halfway through the summer session semester, just to give you an idea of timing. Time flies, as they say. I hope you're well. I'm well. Next class, we'll talk about magazines, and we'll continue to talk about the final project. Take care. Bye-bye.